Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
When you become lawless and you let countries like this fall, you allow this to then be the status quo that could happen in other countries. We're vital to the survival of Africa. We cannot afford to lose this country.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
Welcome to this special bonus episode of Battle Lines with me, Venetia Rainey. This week we're focusing on Sudan. It's the world's forgotten war, a brutal conflict that has killed nearly 20,000 people, displaced over 10 million, and left around 25 million facing acute hunger. The two main parties are the Sudanese army, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, insurgent militia, led by Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemeti. Since fighting erupted between the army and RSF last April, Sudan's cities have been turned into battlefields. Fighting has been marked by mass rape and murder. Hospitals have been attacked. 1 in 5 people have now fled their homes, and cholera is on the rise. The scale of the humanitarian crisis in Sudan far outstrips Gaza and Ukraine, yet it receives almost no attention. So how did things get so bad? Why isn't it being covered more? And is there any prospect of peace? With me in the studio to discuss these questions and more are 3 people with answers and very different perspectives. Dr. Jennifer Hulse has recently returned from a 3-month stint with Médecins Sans Frontières, working at a hospital badly damaged by fighting in Nyala, Darfur. She helped train up local staff to deal with mass casualties and rehabilitate the paediatric, maternity and emergency wards. She trained in emergency medicine and has previously worked for the NHS. Asil Sidahmed worked as an advisor to the Minister of Health in Sudan's second transitional government until it was overthrown by the military coup in 2021. She now works as a public health strategy consultant. She previously spent over a decade working in international aid, supporting operations in Africa, the Middle East, Europe and Latin America. Basma Khalifa is a Sudanese director, filmmaker and writer who recently launched Zola Studios, a production company and creative studio which works with people from across the Middle East and North Africa. She starred in the BBC documentary Inside the Real Saudi Arabia and has directed 2 films about sisters in Cairo and the ritual of henna. Thank you all for joining me in the studio. So Jennifer, I'd like to start with you. On your recent mission with MSF, you were one of the first international medical professionals to reach Nyala Teaching Hospital in Darfur, where they've been struggling to restore basics such as water and electricity following heavy fighting. What exactly had happened to the hospital and what did you see while you were there?
So when we first returned to Nyala at the start of this year, we were really shocked by the level of destruction at Nyala Teaching Hospital. And this is a big hospital. It was previously the referral centre for the whole of South Darfur, so the biggest government hospital in the area. But there was almost no part of it that hadn't been damaged by the conflict. Many of the buildings had huge gaping holes from explosions in the walls of the operating theatres and the roof of the maternity department. The water tanks and the generators had been sprayed with bullets. The warehouse had been completely looted, as had our warehouse and our offices and those of the other NGOs in town. As you mentioned, the water supply and electricity supply to the city had broken down completely, and many of the staff, very understandably, had left, trying to get themselves or their families to safety. So in spite of all this, there were still some staff remaining trying to provide some basic services in pediatrics and maternity, but they had huge challenges. They hadn't been paid since the start of the conflict. There'd been no supply or finance to the hospital since the start of the conflict. And they were having to do things like pay someone to go and collect water with a donkey cart and just literally bring barrels of water to the hospital because that was the only way to get water. They had a little generator that they were running for a couple of hours a day. But even these very, very basic services they were able to provide, most of the patients couldn't afford because they were having to charge for treatment because they had no other way to recover the costs. So really, the healthcare system had almost completely broken down at that point.
And was this hospital intentionally attacked?
I don't know. It's very difficult to say whether any of it was intentional or whether it was just indiscriminate and they just didn't care. The hospital was unlucky enough to have been positioned opposite an SAF base. So the whole
the Sudanese
area
armed forces,
yes,
so allied with the Sudanese
armed
army.
forces, so opposite a big military base. So the hospital and the whole area around it had been extremely badly damaged. There were other hospitals in the city that hadn't had quite the same level of infrastructure damage, but they were private hospitals and they were struggling with the same things in terms of electricity, water and supply.
So what kind of things did you do while you were out there to help start to fix the situation?
So the first thing that we always do is try to restore water and electricity. That was really challenging. We switched the donkey cart for at least big trucks. So we were shipping in the water in large tankers. We tried to restore and repair some of the water tanks that were leaking and damaged. We fixed a couple of the generators, which had been, we repaired a lot of the structures. We moved some of the services from damaged parts of the hospitals to other parts of the hospital and tried to restore function in pediatrics, maternity, and a small emergency department. So we focused on those sort of most immediately life-saving things to begin with. Additionally, a lot of the staff who remained were quite junior doctors. So we did things like implement a triage system, which made a big difference, do a lot of teaching and training on trauma management of war wounded, and start making a mass casualty plan so we could prepare if the fighting intensified again.
What kind of injuries was the hospital receiving?
So when I was in Nyala, there was not much active fighting in the area. There were still occasional airstrikes, maybe once a week, mostly focusing on military targets, but we would still see gunshot wounds, mostly from just general kind of the breakdown of law and order in the city. So people were very desperate. There was huge inflation. People were displaced. They'd lost their income. There was a lot of robberies. There was a lot of violence, people robbing market traders, people breaking into homes. So we saw a lot of gunshot wounds from stuff like that rather than active conflict. We did still see injuries, particularly to children, from unexploded ordnance, so from bombs that were lying around the city that children find and pick up. But the main thing that we were seeing in Nyala, certainly, more than the war wounded at that point, was people dying of just simple, untreated infections, which should have been preventable if they'd had access to even basic healthcare. So children dying of things like malaria, pneumonia, diarrhea, and dehydration, very, very simple treatable things. And it was really sad because often they would die within a couple of hours of arrival. So it had taken them so long to get to us, or so long to make the decision to seek care because they were scared of the charges, that by the time they reached us, there was nothing that we could do.
And how much of that is related to the food insecurity that Sudan is seeing? Obviously, the scale of challenge is enormous. As I mentioned earlier, more than 25 million people are facing acute hunger. That's over half of Sudan's population. And I know famine has already been declared in one area, North Darfur, but in 15 other areas it's considered to be at risk.
Yeah, so particularly in children, a lot of it was related to their nutritional status. So children who are malnourished are really much more at risk of infections, particularly things like measles, pneumonia. They don't recover in the same way because their immunity is compromised. So we were seeing a lot of deaths in malnourished children. We were seeing a lot of women who weren't able to breastfeed their babies because they could barely feed themselves. And yeah, there's a lot of areas of Sudan where we actually don't have that information. We know that Zamzam camp, a displacement camp for 500,000 people, they have officially declared a famine in that place. But there are other places where we just don't have the data. So it's highly likely that there's a huge nutritional crisis in other areas of Sudan, but we're just not aware of it yet.
And what are the obstacles to more aid getting in terms of medicinal aid, food aid?
So the main barrier has been from the beginning deliberate obstruction by both warring parties, so deliberately denying access to humanitarian aid as a military tactic. So really weaponizing access to aid, denying the population in the areas that are not controlled by them, denying them the supplies, denying them access to assistance, essentially. And that takes the form of denial of visas, refusal of travel permits, closure of borders, denying access to certain roads, deliberate administrative and logistical hurdles to importing things into the country and getting staff into the country as well.
Clearly quite a knotty conflict, having a huge human cost on the ground. Asil, I want to bring you in here and let's go back a bit and explain how we got here, because it's complicated for people who might not be aware of all the sort of various stages that Sudan has gone through over the last few years. You joined the transitional government that was installed in 2019 following months of popular protests. Those outed the brutal long-time dictator Omar al-Bashir. Can you describe what the mood and political landscape was like in Sudan at the time?
So I joined the second transitional cabinet, and I'd say that at that point, the mood was a lot less optimistic than it had been following the first transitional cabinet, which was much more technocratic. So the second part of the transition was really about trying to get more involvement from Sudan's many, many political parties. I'm talking about over 20 political parties. And this sort of national process was a unique model. It was different than the model that I'd seen in Yemen or in South Africa. And for me, it was a unique experience because it was the first time I had a relationship to the country. I wasn't going as an expat. I was going as diaspora. And so I felt simultaneously so proud and motivated by the civil servants I had the privilege to work with, who were probably some of the most brilliant, efficient, professional civil servants I've worked with in all the countries I've worked with governments in. And that was then juxtaposed and sat really uncomfortably alongside the sense from population that was really losing faith in the transition. And it meant that any transitional government, even if it was perfect, kind of had an impossible task ahead of it. And by the time I got there for the second cabinet, a number of, let's say, political parties and armed groups that became political parties, a la Hezbollah, for example, that kind of reminiscent of that sort of armed group turned into professionalized political party. And that includes Dagalo, the head of the RSF. He was very much professionalizing his presence, courting international organizations, getting IHL certified. And he had a Twitter account. He was getting speech classes. It was really a moment in 2021 where you could see a lot of the armed forces vying for control. And many analysts at that time said the writing's on the wall, that there was a real kind of undermining of the transitional process.
That's really interesting. Basma, I just want to bring you in here as well. What did you experience during that time? What was the mood like?
So the feeling was that everyone was constantly on edge. The fear of waking up every day and being like, oh, there's a protest down the road, or oh, we hear some gunfire, or we hear a couple of things happening, but we're okay. We're still going to go to our weddings. We're still going to go to our dinners. We're going to do normal life until it blows up. So it's a really weird way to live because I always say, as the diaspora living in whatever countries we're living in, we live in complete luxury that we get to watch on. But the real fear for our families and for our loved ones and friends is that we don't know what's going to happen. And living in that day in, day out took its toll. Any Sudanese person that you will talk to will tell you how incredibly resilient they are. I would often be like, you're telling me it's too dangerous to visit, but you're still going to the wedding. People are still getting married, but they continue, and that's what they do. I think when you're living in that kind of restrictive environment, you sort of have to find the light. And it was always about finding the light instead of finding the sadness. So as much as there was fear, of course, it never overshadowed getting on with normal everyday life.
Was there hope amongst your friends and family that the transitional government could start to build something new for Sudan in terms of government?
I mean, when you live in a country that's predominantly Muslim, we are raised on hope. That is what Islam is based in. It's based in hope. So I think there always was, but I think there would have always been an underlining, this is going to go one way or the other. Sudan is filled, as Asil said, of really power-hungry people, as most militaries and most governments are power-hungry. And Sudan's no different to that. So I think even though there was this little slither of hope, I think the reality was a reality. And everyone knew that. It's just whether they were able to face it until it became a reality.
Well, let's talk about that reality and when it all came crashing down in the coup in 2021. Asil, you were in the country at the time, on 25th of October. What was that like? What did you see unfolding in front of you?
So I lived in an area called Burri, which is sort of a revolutionary stronghold in Khartoum, very close to the Nile. The weeks leading up to the coup, there were roadblocks every single day. So what was normally for me a 20-minute commute became 1, 2, 3 hours if I actually managed to get there.
Roadblocks by the Sudanese army?
Roadblocks by the Sudanese army, as well as some roadblocks that began to appear by, I'd say, individuals that were allied to the army and wanted the return of the military, but there were rumors that they were being paid by the military, but nobody really knew who they were. And the roadblocks were intended to protect these sort of counter protesters. So I think it was the night did feel already eerie because the days leading up to the coup, there were already these kind of counter protests that were in support of bringing the military back into control and undermining the cabinet that was existing with the transitional government. And that culminated in the prime minister essentially being kidnapped by the military leader.
Abdallah Hamdok.
Hamdok was kidnapped and taken under house arrest for several weeks, which I guess for some of the protesters who at that point felt that actually this transition has already not been ours for some time, there was a sense of let's begin again, let's start a new revolution. So a lot of analysts and others who comment on Sudan, we tend to think of what unfolded as a counter-revolutionary process, which has ended up in a sort of counter-revolutionary war. It's really easy, I think, to paint it as even the military coup as something that just happens in African countries. You know, there's lots of military dictatorships at the moment. There's a sort of resurgence. It's becoming fashionable to be a military rule. And I think the military really, Burhan in particular, really played on that by saying, I'm not against the transition. I just think Hamdok has failed in the transition and I'm here to set it back on course. So he was really trying to make himself different than Umar al-Bashir, who he'd sold out anyway during the process of getting a transitional deal. And he was trying to position himself as somebody that was going to set Sudan back on track. And a lot of people believed in that because there was a widespread belief that I'm saddened to think about this because Sudan is so multifaceted, just like any country. But one of the facets that I did have to confront at the time was that there are lots of people included in my extended family who want military rule and believe that this is the only way that they can actually be governed and that the only way that they can receive something. This was in direct contradiction with, I think, a generation of people born after the 80s who have felt disenfranchised and just felt that they haven't had futures or opportunities. So I think for me and for quite a number of people, the light that we're always seeking, that I really love that metaphor, Basma, for me, the light did go out for some time. And it's hard as a Sudanese person to admit that kind of defeat. And I think it's ushered in after that time a real conversation with each other around why did we put up with this for so long? Why didn't we fight more? Why didn't we resist more? What is it about us and our society and our culture that's allowed dictatorship to be part of our families? I think the biggest, most invisible epidemic that we have in Sudan at the moment is PTSD. It's mental health, it's trauma. And as diaspora or as people that have left Sudan, as the people that are fortunate or wealthy enough have managed to do, the trauma of leaving and of constantly feeling you can't leave the war because you still have family left sort of behind, those seeds were sown in that environment in the coup where it just felt like this period where there are rules of engagement, there's no more rules anymore. Everything is now possible. You can be shot at.
So is your sense that the legacy of Omar al-Bashir dictatorship was such that people thought that General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the head of the Sudanese army, was a better bet, that they wanted one strong figure they could follow rather than a slightly more diffuse transitional government filled with all these different political figures? Was he popular?
I'd say it was mixed. I think it's not a country where you can do polling and censuses and things like that. So I would say that it was very much mixed because, yes, I think he played on a fantasy that was developed out of Omar al-Bashir, this sense that, like many of the dictators in the region, that they're the only ones that can unify the region, when actually they're also the ones dividing everybody that they're unifying. So Burhan played on that, but there was also a lot of commentary that he's not as charismatic, that he's actually, nobody really knew where he came from. He wasn't one of the prominent military guys that anybody thought would ever take over from Omar al-Bashir. He wasn't from one of the prominent families either. So I think people didn't trust in him so much as they trusted in the military, because they believed that the military had protected them. And what they believed that they were being protected from was anti-Islamic westernization of Sudan, which many in the transition represented. It didn't help many of us were Western educated or that Hamdok came from the UN. So it was more like, this is the lesser of two evils. I think what drove it was essentially people lost faith in the transition. They were expecting to have better quality of life, which they didn't get immediately. So they were like, let's go back to what we know. Getting rid of the transition was the first goal, which then opened the way for the RSF to vie for control.
I should mention that Sudan has actually had the most military takeovers of any African country since its independence in 1956, 6 successful ones, including the most recent, and another 12 attempts. Basma, I want to turn to you because you've got your own story about what that day, 25th of October in 2021, was like. You know, you were watching from afar, but your friends and family were living in a very real way. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, I think probably like Asil's family, like all of our families, everyone was like, what do we do? Do we go? Do we not go? Do we stay? Do we not stay? Also remembering that this is, from a lot of my family in Durman and in Khartoum, is that this is their whole existence. It's their houses, it's their things, it's their memories, they don't know any different. So to ask people to up and leave sounds easy in theory, but it's not easy. You're asking people to leave their whole lives. Quite quickly, I actually worked with a charity, with Choose Love, and raised a significant amount of money to support 3 buses, I think, for normal everyday people who couldn't afford to, because the prices of buses started to skyrocket, because people were like, well, these bus drivers also like, we need to make money as well. So it became this sort of power play between, like, if you want to leave, you got to afford to leave, which was crazy. So I worked very closely with Choose Love to try and support getting some people out. I also worked closely to try and get my own family out. I am very privileged, and we're very privileged that, we can bind together and who can we afford to get out. On one side, my family, that was a bit more achievable. On the other side, not so much. And so for me personally, we had some aunts and uncles who just like, we're not going. We're not leaving. And where they were situated was very close to where a lot of the violence and a lot of the attacks were happening. The area was actually super dangerous. It was next to just where all the fighting was. I can't remember the name. And we finally convinced them to leave. And we were like, okay, when are you exiting the house? And they were like, okay, we're going to go in the morning. We'll keep you updated. We need to get to the bus terminal, all these things. All I know is I was, in my normal everyday London life, I'm sitting in Soho working at a coffee shop. And we were like, okay, they're going to leave. We'll let you know in the next hour or two. And then I get a phone call to say that my auntie had been shot on the way to her car. And she just makes me emotional thinking about it now. She'd sort of just, her daughters had already got into the car. She's just leaving, closing the door of her house. And, they don't care. They're just firing at anyone. Any moving being, is being fired at. Indiscriminate fire of her and 2 uncles. So they all passed away right there and then. As in Islamic ways, you always want to bury the body, you want to take the body, you want to find the body. So they tried to take the bodies and they couldn't. So they all fled, and then they actually sent one of my uncles back to collect the bodies. So they went and got the bodies when the violence sort of simmered in that area, and they buried them. And then they all escaped to Egypt, where they all are now. But the living trauma of that for my poor cousins and aunts and uncles of sort of, hooray, we got out, but we didn't all get out. And that is the trauma that lives within all of us of, what are we celebrating? That we're alive? That someone got to be alive? That, it's it's a mentally very complicated thing to get your head around, to think of who survived and what does survival look like now. Is surviving just existing in a country like Egypt, in a city in Cairo, which is already incredibly influxed with refugees from all the borders, and Sudanese people aren't very favoured in a lot of Arab countries. We are Black, we are African, and that is not a favoured nationality for a lot of people. So the struggle continues. It continues every single day of what does rebuilding our lives look like. It was a very, very difficult time, but you stay and you die, or you try and leave and you die, and that's the reality of the situation.
I think that story also shows just how many people have been scattered all over Sudan, all over the region, all over the wider world. I want to skip forward a bit because there's so much to cover. So after the coup, the Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, as you mentioned, he's in house arrest. He's eventually sidelined and resigns. And then you have these two big military players left wrestling for power. The Sudanese Army, SAF, we've mentioned several times, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, we've also mentioned, led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who we mentioned, but is widely known as Hemeti. What do we know about Hemeti?
So, Hemeti was part of, he's from Western Sudan, from Darfur originally, very close to the border with Chad. He also has family in Chad. And like many of the borders in Sudan, which are very porous, there's an intermixing of cultures, of families and backgrounds. So there's a huge clan that he's part of. And his rise to prominence was the fact that he was supported by Omar al-Bashir for decades to be the head of this Rapid Support Forces. So the Rapid Support Forces really started as this paramilitary group that could do extrajudicial killings in a way that the Sudanese armed forces wasn't equipped to do and didn't necessarily want that type of blood on their hands. Part of the prominence of Hemeti isn't just to do with the relationship to the center. It's also to do with the relationships with other clans within Darfur, where other prominent individuals such as Mini Minnawi have come into prominence, particularly since the transition. And it seems that Hemeti's power base and the support that he gets is greater than some of the kind of more local leaders. Part of that is because of his ability to get weapons across the border from Chad, to tax a lot of the drug kind of pathways within the country, and to give a lot of his followers a sense that he is defending their honor, defending people from Western Sudan who have been marginalized and creating a new sense of a nation.
So after months of tensions, in April 2023, just before Eid, a full-blown civil war erupts, and it's been raging ever since. Jennifer, I want to come back to you and the humanitarian health situation on the ground. Why has this conflict led to such a dramatic and appalling spike in hunger, disease, poverty and displacement? What's specific about what's going on in Sudan?
Even prior to the conflict, there were issues within the Sudanese health system, and there were issues with the nutritional status of the population in some areas. So there were already kind of vulnerabilities there. But I think there has been a real feature of this conflict has been just indiscriminate attacks on civilian infrastructure and indiscriminate attacks on healthcare, and a total lack of respect from both combatants, from both warring parties, about treating hospitals and healthcare as a safe space. To give the example of El Fasher, which is a city in the north of Darfur, which is currently one of the big hotspots, there's been 11 attacks documented by MSF since May on hospitals there. 2 of them resulted in the staff having to withdraw completely from those hospitals because they were so badly damaged, or it became so dangerous that they were unable to continue. And this has been happening throughout the whole country. So there's direct damage to the hospitals, and there's healthcare workers being forced to flee because it's really not safe for them to work. And it's been such a prominent feature of this conflict, and it's really interesting to me that it has not been picked up on in the same way internationally, in terms of the kind of outrage, in terms of the kind of media coverage that we see when similar things happen in other countries. It's just somehow become accepted that this is what is happening in Sudan.
We'll come on to that very important question a bit later about why it's covered in such a different way. I wonder if you could share some of the stories of the people that you came across, because we've been talking in a lot of big numbers, millions of people displaced, facing hunger, so on, but it would be good to hear some more personal stories that you came across.
I mean, many of our own staff had suffered just as much as the rest of the population. So a lot of their stories, even though they were turning up to work every day, they were very traumatized and they had been through, just as much as the rest of the population. So we had some of our staff who'd been displaced. They'd gone to Zamzam camp, which is this big camp where there's this huge malnutrition crisis. They'd come back to Nyala when it had been safe to do so, but the children of our own staff were badly malnourished and had to be put in the therapeutic feeding program because they themselves weren't able to feed their own kids. And I remember one of the staff in the maternity department coming into work that day and telling me sort of very coldly, very blankly that her childhood friend had been killed. And the thing that was so striking about it was her lack of reaction. It had been going on for a year and people had just become so accustomed to this level of violence.
Basma, let's talk about that level of violence because it has been really brutal. Just a recent news report earlier this month, it was reported that RSF fighters rampaged through a village, they looted, they burned, they killed at least 85 people, including children. And reportedly that happened after the villagers resisted attempts by the fighters to abduct and sexually assault the community's women and girls. We've heard lots of similar reports by both sides. Why has this conflict been so violent and why has sexual violence been such a marker of it as well?
I think it's pure terrorism. And terrorism, when it happens, it attacks the weakest. The weakest in our society are children and women, and that's really the peak of it. It's easy to attack those who can't protect themselves. It doesn't mean that men aren't more subject to attacks, but it's easy to control and take hold of women. And I think raping a woman, raping children, whatever it is, it's the most volatile thing you can do while keeping someone alive. And I think that is the aim. The aim is to cause complete terror. I think this war is so fascinating because no one even really at this stage knows what they're fighting for, because by the time they flatten the whole country, it's like, what are we really doing? But you've created a situation where these are militia. This is people coming from neighboring countries. This is people that have no allegiance to Sudan either. If you think of the militia from Chad or from other these neighboring countries, they don't care. They just are like, oh, we're just going to get to go on a manhunt and just spray bullets whatever we want and do whatever we want. And we've really gotten to a stage in Sudan where we've created like a no man's land situation. Anyone can do whatever they want. And when you get to that situation, when there is it's lawless, of course, the most vulnerable will be women and children.
You mentioned other actors like fighters from Chad. One question that's come up a lot in this conflict is who's supporting the two sides, both militarily and politically. Countries that have been named include the UAE, Iran, Egypt, Russia. So from a Western perspective, a lot of the sort of more questionable states. It's obviously a very charged issue. There's a lot of misinformation around it. And the lack of access for journalists makes it particularly hard to report accurately on a lot of this stuff. Is it fair to consider this a proxy war for Middle Eastern actors? Or do you think that goes too far?
I think that what we've seen in terms of the trends around wars in the region for the last decade since the Arab Spring have been proxy war is actually insufficient. It doesn't go far enough. I think partly because of the way that globalization has meant that economic, financial, and human resource interests are so intertwined, even more intensely in somewhere like Sudan, which is a crossroads for so many people and so much migration, so many resources, so many companies have outposts there. So a proxy war would suggest that this war was instigated by others in order to achieve particular ends. I wouldn't say that that's accurate. What I would characterize it as is this is a war for whom many regional and international actors such as the US and Russia have interests in the outcomes and in control of particular areas. I mean, a war's biggest resources are money, weapons, and fighters. So I think when we're doing the analysis, while it's relevant to think about who's backing particular actors, that's a very traditional way of doing an analysis. It's also easier for people when they're trying to negotiate peace talks like the ones last week in Geneva. I think it doesn't explain sometimes the honor and the pride and the emotion that also goes into fueling people going into armed conflict. And there is a sense for a lot of the RSF fighters of revenge. We heard stories that when they would go to Khartoum and loot, houses, it was, we're taking back the thing that actually belongs to us. And I think it's going to be difficult to map onto that any particular actor that can back that. There's a level at which a proxy war suggests that they're being puppeteered, when I think that there's a duality, there's a kind of, it undermines the agency that some of these armed groups have. I think it would also be amiss if we didn't point out that, for example, the Sudanese people that are speaking today, we're from a particular ethnic background in Sudan. We are lighter skinned. We are from what's called the Nilotic regions. We're closer to Khartoum. We have access to privilege. We have access to passports. We have access to different modes of education that are westernized. Those things aren't as accessible to the rest of Sudan necessarily. And I think one of the biggest resources fueling these wars are the people that continue to join them. And some of them have very legitimate grievances of why they've decided to join both the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid security forces, which is that they have never had a central government that's really benefited them, particularly people that are closer to the border with Chad, people that are close to the border with South Sudan, and people close to the border with the Red Sea. And as such, I think there is another tricky dynamic where it can be very easy for us to decry anybody that would join a war.
Let's talk about one of the reasons that we're recording this podcast, and that's the fact that the Sudan war is just barely covered in mainstream media anymore. Why do you think it's not covered more, and why is it treated differently from other conflicts, both in the press and in the international aid communities? Jennifer, maybe you want to kick us off.
I think it comes down to the fact that people in Europe and the US, they feel like conflict in the Ukraine and in Gaza is sort of threatening to them personally in terms of the potential consequences for them. In Gaza, if it spreads to the Middle East, and in Ukraine, because it's on the doorstep of Europe. Whereas something happening in Sudan, a lot of people couldn't find it on a map. They don't think that it's, of the same geopolitical significance to them personally. They may be wrong, but that's the perception. And I think it comes down again to, something happening in Europe, maybe front page news, something happening in the Middle East, maybe you will get a line somewhere, something happening in Africa. People are less interested.
And in the international aid community, because there's been differing responses, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It is very challenging to access for the reasons that we've already spoken about, and there is deliberate blockage of international humanitarian aid. But even considering that, I think a lot of agencies have been really slow to come back to places that they evacuated from early in the conflict. So Niala in South Darfur, for example, it's the second biggest city outside of Omdurman and Khartoum, and the epicenter of a massive disaster. And when I first went there in March, there was no other agency with international staff on the ground there. And
no
when
UN, no nothing.
When I left in June, we were still the only agency with international staff on the ground there.
Basma, why do you think this conflict is not covered to the same extent as other conflicts?
I mean, as a filmmaker and a storyteller, I think the story is easier when there's a bad guy. And it's a very understandable bad guy, and you can be angry at them, and you can social media about them, and you can talk about them. It's not really obvious to the public who the bad guy is when they're both bad. Human behavior is what's right and what's wrong. And in a conflict where two people are wrong, well, then you put your hands up and you sort of say, okay, well, guess there's no winning here. And if there's no winning, there's nothing to invest in. Because what is the win? Why would the average everyday person walking around here, what are they wanting to win? I think even you'd ask a normal Sudanese person, they'd be like, not sure. I don't really know what I'm asking for now. And I think when you don't have an answer like that, when you don't have what the fight is, you don't have what you're trying to win, you don't have a person to be angry at or a body to be angry at, it loses momentum. I don't even really blame the everyday person. If there's not a clear story, you can't follow it through. And that's why I think it's lost momentum in the press. I think that's why it's lost momentum in social media. Everyone wants to point their finger, right?
So as we've mentioned, ceasefire talks are underway. They're being mediated by the US, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and others, being held in Switzerland. How hopeful are you guys that progress can be made? And what are the big obstacles in the way? Asil, maybe we can start with you.
I'm not hopeful right now because of what happened in Geneva recently. So earlier this month, peace talks were supposed to happen in Geneva, brokered by the US, and the RSF were a no-show. They didn't comply, and at first there was a lot of speculation and rumor around why they weren't there and why they didn't comply. And I think ultimately there wasn't any incentive for them. Every conflict needs to burn out of either all of its sources of fuel. It needs to burn out of support. It needs to burn out of money. It needs to burn out of weapons. And it doesn't seem like either side is burning out of those anytime soon. And it doesn't seem that there's a common enough incentive from either side to save the country. I think what earlier this month showed us is that neither of these parties have allies that they trust enough for them to engage in this process. And that trust needs to not just be that, I scratch your back, you scratch mine, but they need to feel afraid that they're going to lose something if they don't comply to a peace process. And so having this war be totally silent actually, removes from all of us that are fighting and advocating for peace a really big weapon that most international leaders need in order to act, which is public humiliation and shame. They're basically killing in the dark. Nobody can see it. So there's no accountability. And it's really unacceptable. And it makes us question, why is it Sudan isn't getting this level of attention? What is it about us that, doesn't warrant or deserve that level of interest and need? And I think that's something for listeners to think about and reflect on in themselves, because we don't live in a world where it's acceptable to only care about what happens to your neighbor. Your neighbors are sort of everywhere. And when 2.5 million people are going to die from hunger next month, it's sort of something to make people wake up a little bit, I think.
Really? Basma, what do you think?
We are raised on hope. And as a Sudanese person and as all Sudanese people, and I actually think on this one, I can't speak on behalf of all of us. If we don't have hope, we have nothing. So I have to have hope that something will happen. I have to have hope that we will one day return to Sudan. I have to be able to tell my cousins that, and my nieces that, and I have to be able to believe it. And so I fundamentally refuse to believe that there is no hope. And in saying that, yes, it will happen one day. And it will happen in our lifetime, and we have to believe that.
I want to end, given that this is such a poorly or just uncovered conflict, what is one thing that you guys think is misunderstood, or one thing that you'd like listeners to take away, or something that we haven't covered in this chat?
I think the main thing for people to consider is that the amount of media coverage that a crisis gets is not at all proportional to the amount of people affected, or to the amount of suffering, or to the amount of needs of the population. And this is why organizations like MSF are so important, because we're able to take the global view and we're able to respond to things which are neglected. We're able to respond to things that are the neglected crises, the things that are not kind of the popular movement of the moment. And yeah, I think that's hopefully something that we do well.
Basma.
I think for me personally, I actually read something or watched something on TikTok of all places recently that said that Sudan, we're the Horn of Africa. We border a lot of countries. We border the Red Sea. We have the Nile. We are incredibly resource rich. You lose the Horn of Africa, you begin to lose Africa. This is how the seeds of colonization happen. This is how the seeds of these genocides happen. When you become lawless and you let countries like this fall, you allow this to then be the status quo that can happen in other countries. And I think that people don't believe how important Sudan is to Africa. At one stage, we were the largest country. And I would want, if anyone was listening to this, to take away, to remember that, we're vital to the survival of Africa. We cannot afford to lose this country.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.
Get ready for an unforgettable experience at the U.S. Border Collie Handlers Association's National Sheepdog Finals. From September 30th to October 6th, Belgrove Plantation hosts the 2024 American Championship right here in our own backyard. Witness top handlers and their skilled dogs in a breathtaking display of teamwork and precision. Bring the whole family for fun, food, and spectacular entertainment. Tickets are selling fast. Get your tickets now, including discounts on 3-day and week-long passes. Visit belgrove.org for your tickets today.